Hey, Raleigh, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah,
We've just had a few technical difficulties, which is
minor glitches.
minor glitches, which is a really good reminder that we are so not in control of
Yeah,
anything.
absolutely.
So,
Hard lesson. I keep
it,
learning it.
I know. Well, I got to meet you in person, oh gosh, a couple months ago, maybe it was, and we
Mhm.
started having this awesome conversation, and then we had to shift to a different conversation for the event that we were at. But I
Right.
wanted to snag you for this because I was so intrigued by what you were saying about, well, a lot of things, but especially about codependency. You have
Hmm.
deep experience working with families and young people. And so here we are to have that
Yeah,
conversation. So thank you for
yeah.
joining me. I really appreciate it.
Of course, my privilege, really.
Why don't you give us just a quick background so people can sort of get to know who you are and how you came to be doing the work that you're doing today, and then we'll dive in.
Okay. Well, as for everybody, it's always personal at first, at least. And I grew up in a pretty unhealthy, dysfunctional home with a lot of violence. And at 16, I made a pact with myself that I was going to grow up and have a healthy, happy family. And when my wife and I started chatting about marriage, we made that same pact and that we were going to parent different, but we didn't know what that meant or even where to find all that. Fast forward, we have a couple of kids and we actually had a pretty good family and marriage, but I still had stuff from my history that was haunting, shall we say, and I couldn't figure it out. What was going on? What do I do? By this time, I'm, bachelor's in social work and then a master's in social work, and I'm doing private therapy work, and a lot of different things have come and gone, and I'm still not showing up the way I want to. And along comes the discussion of codependency, and it just didn't fit for me. I don't typically do a lot of enabling and rescuing, caretaking kind of stuff. And so I was just really puzzled, what that was all about. And I began, well, first of all, I went to a residential program for codependency because it was seemed like the only place I could, move. This was the late 90s. The only place I could go that I thought might be useful. I got introduced to 12-step program and the idea of recovery and realized that recovery is not just about alcohol or drug addiction. It's about many other dynamics. And I just became in love with addiction recovery. And even though I'm trained in the mental health model, I realize there's this thing that we call recovery that actually offers a different way to live. And I was trying to figure it out. So by the late 90s, I'm looking at codependency. It doesn't quite fit. And I start trying to figure out what else, is out there. How does this work? So I ran across some material that started me thinking a little differently about codependency. And that's the beginning then of what I ultimately began to call external dependency.
Yeah,
So
and
that's
that's
kind of
what
the,
snagged me. I was like,
yeah,
wait a minute, what are you talking about? Because that it really piqued my interest, especially because I work with a lot of moms, obviously,
right.
and parents in general, whose kids are struggling and they get this label. It's almost like somebody comes up with this label machine and just like,
Yeah,
you're codependent.
absolutely.
And
Right.
it feels bad. It feels kind of
Hmm.
shameful. It feels like we've done something wrong. And
Right.
so that's why I really wanted to dive into that today because when you were talking about it, it just started to make so much more sense. And I think
Mm.
the people that are doing the labeling aren't meaning bad. I think
Right.
they mean well and they're trying
Right.
to give you a framework or something to work with.
Hmm.
But when you hear codependency, like what was not working for you about the traditional kind of codependent label?
Hmm. Well, the rescuing and caretaking, my wife is just an amazingly nurturing, loving, gentle person. And I'm very kind and understanding and compassionate, but it doesn't drive me to do too much for people typically. And the codependency label when we look at the history of where it came from and the dynamics around who were those people that were called codependents, we've really pathologized that nurturing dynamic in a way that's not helpful to anybody. And not only that, we've also misunderstood that the unhealthy version of doing too much is really as hard to stop doing as not drinking. And so it really is a compulsive pattern. And to say to somebody, stop rescuing, stop enabling, is just incredibly unkind and lacks any value, really. And so, I mean, I had my struggle with it because it didn't fit for me. And I also saw the way that it was being used in a way that was hurtful and not celebrating the amazing power of that gentle, kind, nurturing, way that people show up. So I just had to find something else that was really getting to the core of it. And that's what really started me. I was like, well, okay, so if this codependency thing is real, that's a behavioral manifestation. I tell the story of coming home with my family one Sunday afternoon from camping, and we walk in the door and there's this horrendous smell that just slams us in the face. We're like, oh my goodness, what happened while we were gone, right? So we run around, we open all the doors and windows, and we get the spray out of the bathroom, and we're spraying away, And of course the spray reduced, right? And so if you're going to think about it from a codependency standpoint, that's the solution. Deal with the symptom. And I wanted to know, when we walked in that door, where's this smell coming from? Because I want to get rid of it. And of course, we eventually found a rotten potato in the pantry. And if anybody's ever smelled a rotten potato, you know exactly what I mean. Yes. It's horrendous stuff. That's the way.
Interesting that you. Okay, I get it.
Yeah. That's the way I began to think about it. It's like, okay, what is at the core? Because it might be driving other unhealthy patterns that I could relate to, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah.
I think you said this, or maybe I just wrote it down because this is what my brain interpreted, was this compulsive helping. And I don't know if you said that or if I just put that in my own brain, but this compulsive desire to help, I think, is what a lot of, and I'm just going to say moms because I don't work with too many dads, so I don't know that I'm qualified to say this about them, but so many moms, we just have this compulsive need to help.
Right.
And so I know we're going to get to why that is, because you've looked for the reason, you've looked for the rotten potato.
Yes.
And it's interesting when you said that this is a behavioral manifestation, that really struck me, because I think we are always thinking it's in our brain, right? It's like, I have this mental defect or something.
Right.
But when you say it's a behavioral manifestation, that to me is helpful, because it's like, well, I can change a behavior.
Right.
Which feels good, because then I think, okay, I can do something about this.
Sure. And the other part about is changing behavior is if we know what's driving it, then we can do something about it. And this is why I think people have failed so miserably in their efforts to not be codependent, is because there's too much focus on the behavior. I tell parents, you don't change behavior by changing behavior. That's where everybody wants to go in a way, but that's not how you change behavior. You got to know what's underneath it, what's driving it. And that's what I began looking for, trying to figure that whole equation out.
So what is the rotten potato behind this compulsive helping we tend to do?
So I found two things behind it that lead up to what I would call maladaptive compulsive behavior patterns. And I know that's a little jargony, and I'm sorry about that. We all have heard of malware today, right?
Yes.
Unhealthy software, right, so to speak. Well, maladaptive, when I think about my ways of adapting to my children's misbehavior, my way of adapting to things I didn't like, right? It was unhealthy, but it was compulsive. And of course, compulsive is another word for addictive, right? We do it even though we didn't intend to. And so when we look at that and we begin to explore underneath those patterns, we find two specific, very fascinating things. And I'm just going to reference a couple of books for people because they can read a little bit about this. The first book that I found actually was from Terry Kellogg, who was one of the early writers about codependency back in the 80s. And he wrote this book called Broken Toys, Broken Dreams. And I don't know that it's still in publication. I don't think it is, but it's still available out there in used copies. It's a very, very heavy read. But he understood things about codependency that I don't think too many other people did. And on page 7, he makes a really fascinating statement talking about enabling behavior. He says, it appears as if the problem of enabling codependency, etc., is about the relationship with a dependent. And then he uses a really interesting word that we're all familiar with, and that's the word but. Well, but negates everything before it, right?
Yep.
And then he goes on to say, it's actually the absence of a relationship with self. And when I first read that, I'm like, what in the world? That doesn't even make any sense to me at all. How in the world can you not have a relationship with yourself, right?
Yeah.
We live in our skin. We get up with ourselves in the morning. We brush our teeth. We go through all the things. How can you not have a relationship with self, right? So I don't know, it just really caught my attention. And I have to tell you, it took me a couple of years, quite frankly, to really begin to think I was starting to understand a little bit of what he was saying. But that was the first glimpse that something else is behind this for me.
Okay,
So.
I like that. And I'm sure you're going to dig into that a little bit for those of us who are still scratching our heads saying, but wait, I have a relationship.
Yeah. Right. So the next big piece came from Parenting from the Inside Out by Dan Siegel and Mary Hartzell. One of the 2 best books on parenting, in my opinion. And I think that it's really striking to realize that there's a huge scientific dynamic around parenting. That's not surprising, but at the same time, we don't think of it that way, right? We just kind of do parent what we do in our parenting. Where does that come from? Well, it all comes originally from our own experience, right? But what if that experience interfered with the development of the very things we need in order to parent well, in order to have healthy relationships? And that's what Dan Siegel talks about in the scientific section of the book on adult attachment. And this is page 169, paragraph 1, and it's the first sentence. Actually, it's the first 3 sentences of that paragraph. And I'll just work with the first one. What he says is, if the development of the neural machinery necessary for self-understanding is limited, then our capacity for a rich inner life and to relate to the inner lives of others is also going to be quite limited. And he talks about the reason why it gets limited. And then he goes on to say that when this happens, it can actually leave us without skills that we need in order to function well in relationships. So that when I read that one made sense to me, first of all, because I had already been studying the impact of trauma on development. And the impact is very, very clear. In fact, if anybody ever does any AI searches on the impact of trauma on development, it literally says it's unambiguous. In other words, it is so crystal clear. The research is without question, and that is that it disrupts healthy development. Right. Well, I know for sure people like me who grew up with a very violent dad, trauma was every single day. Yeah. Even if nobody was being knocked around, you're still in that high anxious state. right?
Of course.
And that means that our brains are focused on where's it coming from? When will it come? And all of our energy in childhood is supposed to be all about growth and development. When some of it gets focused on where's the next blow coming from, we're missing out on some of that developmental process. And so what I began to read about was how profound that disruption was. And that the limited neural machinery, and Dan Siegel says specifically the neural machinery that's involved in our relationship with ourself. And now I'm thinking about Terry Kellogg, the absence of relationship with self. And I'm going, holy smokes, this is amazing. Truly scientifically based explanation of why so many of us focus on things around us instead of being connected within us.
Makes so much sense when you say it that way.
Mind-blowing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I began to realize the thing about codependency is that I'm uncomfortable inside of me. Call it whatever.
Right.
Call it shame, call it anxious, call it sad or depressed, call it scared. It doesn't matter. It's a whole variety of different potential things, right? But I don't know what to do with that because managing and processing emotions and relational dynamics is the most complex human activity. And when your neural systems are not adequately developed, you literally do not have what it takes to process emotions and relational dynamics and situations. And so what do? We get focused on things around us in order to distract. And the other part of it is I can't control inside, but maybe I can control outside. And if I can just get my kids to do the things they're supposed to do, act properly, dress right, present properly, finish high school, go on to college, and put a big, star on the window of my home that says, I'm a good mom, I'm a good dad. The whole draw is external, right?
Totally.
It blew my mind.
Yeah, I was just reprocessing all of that. And what that makes me think about is for people like you who grew up in a violent home, let's say, but what about people who say, well, I didn't grow up in a violent home.
Right.
I grew up in a perfectly happy home.
Exactly.
And yet they exhibit these tendencies of the chronic unhealthy. They have the unhealthy software, basically. What's going on there?
Well, it is actually the same thing because we now know enough about trauma that it's not just what we used to call it, big T, little t, but it's a whole spectrum. It's on, my favorite definition of trauma comes from Dr. Robert Scare in his book, The Trauma Spectrum, where he talks about a continuum of variably negative life events. And we've all heard about death by 1,000 paper cuts, right?
Yeah.
And what happens in some homes is that there's not the violence that I had, but there is very, very busy moms and dads. And children aren't necessarily getting the relational needs met. They have food, they have a place to sleep, they have parents that love them and care about them. See, I always say the Beatles were wrong. It's not all about love. Love is not all you need, right? Yeah. We needed other things, but it's hard to focus on the needs of children. So this takes me to another observation, I suppose would be the best way to say it. We live in a world that gives a lot of lip service to the value of our children and our families. Yes, but we give very little actual focus to the needs of a child. And so there's a lot of needs that we miss. And for good parents, which most parents are good parents, for good parents, it's not as much about I'm not meeting their needs as it is I'm trying to survive in a world that no longer takes 2 people to survive in. It really takes 3 people to survive. It's no longer a 2-income world we live in, And in the past, we could say some of the norms about parenting were really abusive. because they were in historical perspective on parenting. But we're getting to a place where people are so preoccupied just to survive that the needs of children are often missed. And it's in the context of love, it's in the context of intention, it's in the context of parents that are really trying their very best. But think about a single parent. I mean, the unbelievable pressure in that system, right? And they're often isolated too, and they don't have a support system. So we could go a lot of different places. Now, one other place I wanted to go in response. I want to say up front, I'm not anti-religion or anti-spirituality, but there is a really serious problem in a lot of the religion of today in the way that people are expected to behave in certain perfect ways. And there is a real dynamic called religious addiction. I grew up in a religious addicted home, and I know the impact. And I have other members of my family who grew up in that environment. No drugs, no alcohol, no substance addiction per se, but the experience in church or in the religious environment was so demanding that there was no room to be human. And that's abusive. And so many loving people that are very heavily involved in those kind of environments of serving others and being available to help others in whatever ways that might look like. Again, external dependency. It's got a lot of different faces, right? A lot of different faces. And boy, I'm doing all this good work externally, but what am I doing to take care of my own heart and my children? I don't know if that helps answer your question, but that's the way I'm seeing it.
Well, the phrase that really got me when we were talking in person was this external dependency, because it really made me think about, oh yeah, if I don't know how to do the work inside me, and I don't know how to have a relationship inside me, then I'm always like, I think of it as like pinging everything outside of me. Like I'm pinging. Oh, I can do that. Oh, I can do that. Oh, I can do that. And like you said, if I can just get all of the ducks in a row and check all of the boxes in my family, then I can be like, pat on the back, like, yes, I did it. And then, I would be so curious to hear your thoughts on this. There's a lot of marriages that fall apart, and a lot of women in particular who fall apart when their kids go to college, when the kids graduate from college, because their entire identity has been wrapped around the kids and the perfect kids and doing all of that. And then when the kids are kind of launched, either parents still are so involved, right? Like overly involved. I mean, I know people whose kids have graduated from college and they are still tracking their location. Like, oh, why is she there at this time of day?
Right.
Is that another example of this like external dependency?
Absolutely. I mean, I understand that there are times when GPS tracking has great value, but I think for the most part, it's a real curse, quite frankly. I really do. And it is a hyper focus on others in a way that keeps me distracted from myself. I eventually came up with what I call the sentence: trauma disrupts development, leaving us unfinished, disconnected, and externally oriented.
Wow.
And that is the underlying problem that I think drives all dysfunctions. And I know that's a broad claim, okay? I haven't tried to prove, I'm not a researcher, I'm not going to try to prove it, but that's my observational statement, is that this is what I see happening, is a world that doesn't meet the needs of children. And so they have varying degrees of trauma that keeps them disconnected from themselves and focused on the world around them. And then they learn how to live that way and parent from that perspective of hyper focus on making them be okay. And the cycle just continues to repeat in those systems. So
I know you've worked with a lot of young people, and I'm wondering what the trauma is that you're seeing that these kids have been raised in, I think the inattention that you mentioned of parents, the distraction and busyness and the anxiety of parents is a kind of an obvious one because we're all glued to our phones. Like,
Yeah.
thank goodness
Yeah.
that wasn't the case when I was parenting, because I would have been even more absent. We just weren't at that
Understand.
point yet when my kids were young. Thank goodness. I'm
Yeah.
so glad. But when you see young people who are struggling today, what are the things that have impacted them significantly from kind of a trauma standpoint?
So this is a really interesting one to me. Again, another observation that I made. I've been studying parenting since before we had kids. So that's over 45 years, trying to figure out how to do it right and do it well. And unfortunately, my kids were growing too fast. But anyway, bottom line is that an observation that I made about the basic dynamics of parenting, I call it the classic parenting model. And it's got gentle versions and harsher versions, but they are all rooted in three things: control, correction, and consequences. And that system doesn't work. And most people have never realized that because it's promoted across the board, around the world, as the right way to parent your kids. And this literally goes back to the second developmental stage, which is the stage of autonomy. And the stage of autonomy is where a person begins to discover, hey, I'm different. I'm not you, and you're not me. And in child development terms, we call it differentiation. I can begin to tell the difference between I'm over here and you're over there. But this is literally what we have begun to label, or not begun, but for years have labeled as the terrible twos, because it's a time where they're discovering themselves and their desire to do things their own way. And what do we do with that? We are historically taught that you have to win those battles over those 2-year-olds to show them you're in charge and that you are not going to give up control, that they've got to comply. They have to do what they're told. And again, this is not about bad parents. And in the gentlest version of the classic parenting model, we see kind of almost gentle emotional manipulation of, oh, don't make mommy sad, or don't make daddy mad, right? I mean, it's some of that stuff shows up in different places, right? So what I see happening is that this control, correction, and consequences model starts with a lie that it's our job to control our kids, and it perpetuates and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And we literally are dealing with challenges in adolescence that started with the way we were dealing with them at 2 years old. And we didn't realize it. We don't realize it. So, I mean, there's a lot of more things that could be said there. I don't know that we want to get into consequences today, but that's part of the equation here, you know?
Yeah. So these kids that are struggling have sort of been raised in an environment where their parents are doing these three things: the control, the correction, and the consequences.
Yep.
And I hear that a lot from different therapists that I talk to, which is the kids need to be their own person. And we are desperately trying to make them either like mini versions of us or mini versions of a sibling or whatever it is that we think.
What looks good.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a difficult place for a young person to be. And then we wonder why they lash out or why they rebel or why they dye their hair purple or why they pierce their belly button.
Yep. Exactly. And again, it's not about bad parents. We're doing what we're taught. We're doing what we're told is good parenting. We're doing it in the best way we can. But I remember a talk I was giving to a group of parents with children that had addictions, adolescents, and it was live, and we were in this room, and there were parents, you know, that were taking notes, and I said, consequences don't work. I made that comment in the, you know, the bigger context. One mom in the back of the room, her head just jerked up like it was going to fly off, right? And she literally threw her pen on the floor. She was like, why hasn't anybody ever told me that? I have been trying to figure out the right consequence. And it's the control piece about helping them learn, helping them get what they're supposed to get. And she was really conscientious, trying her hardest, and was in that moment, it was just all that tension released with the realization it's true. I have been trying and it has never worked. Yeah. So control is where it starts. And I love Adam Price, his book, He's Not Lazy. He talks about the paradoxical response. The more you try to control your teenager, the more they will resist. And the more they resist, the more we will try to control them. And it sets up this battle for control that just perpetuates and deepens the trauma and disrupts the developmental process ongoing for years. And it just continues the disaster.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a million questions. We might have to do a part 2 of the podcast on the 3 C's, because I think I can hear everybody leaning in like, okay, then tell me what to do instead. But what I would love to do is go back to the external dependency. And if we start to recognize that in ourselves and we say, ooh, you know what? That kind of sounds like me. Like I don't have a lot of relationship with myself. Actually, can I ask a really basic question?
Sure.
What would one recognize in themselves if they don't have a great relationship with themselves? Yeah.
So I mentioned that I had gotten a little clarity when I read that material from Dan Siegel about, the neural development being disrupted and trying to fit these pieces together. I ran across another fascinating piece that actually helped me understand this absence of relationship by understanding what a real relationship with self might look like. This is actually from a book on the adolescent brain by Dan Siegel, Brainstorm. A lot of people are probably familiar with that book. This is page 44, paragraph 4. He identifies 15 aspects of the relationship with self. And it's a really interesting list. I'm going to read it. I happen to have it here. I have these little papers that I have a bunch of them in my desk here. And every one of my clients gets this list, okay? It's like, because this is real.
Page number. It's so brilliant.
This is real recovery. See, recovering, and we'll go back to that in a second, because that's another key part to external dependency. But here we go. Sensations, impulses, perceptions, beliefs, thoughts, feelings, memories, images, intentions, attitudes, hopes, dreams, desires, motivations, and longings. That's the list. It's not in list form, it's in sentence form, but if you extract them out, that's what you get. And then he concludes by saying, and there's probably more things. And I added 3 more things that are pretty common. One is fantasies. We all have fantasies about what we'd like, right? And then, of course, the big old discussions of our needs and our wants, right? A relationship with self that is healthy is the person who is able to tap into any or all of those at will and to tune into what's going on inside and what is it telling me. See, our bodies, our emotions, all of these are different ways that we communicate with ourselves. And we have been taught not to listen. And that, I want to go back to that now for a second. If you think about an infant is so profoundly connected with themselves. They don't even care if they're in the middle of someplace like an orchestra, like which everybody should be really quiet, right? If they're going to scream, they don't care. No. They're going to scream. It's like, this is not okay. You have been here 45 minutes and that's long enough. Let's go, right? Yes. And so they're profoundly connected physiologically, emotionally, even though they don't call it an emotion, right? And even mentally, to the degree that an infant has mental functioning, which of course they have a lot of, but it just isn't articulated in words, right? When they get old enough and they start getting cognitive processing going on, we get real excited. We love it when they can put a whole sentence together. And then we start teaching them, use your words, which is not a bad idea, but how about, can you use your words to talk about how you're feeling physically, emotionally, what your perception of what I just did is? And I have a lesson in one of my parent classes that I call the 3 questions. And these are 3 questions that we can ask ourselves to begin to understand our children and where they're coming from. Because when we understand them, now we know how they interpret what I just did, and that tells me why they're doing what they're doing. It's not random stuff. It's not oppositional, even though it looks oppositional in many cases. It's really, there's a reason behind it, right? Yeah. So anyway, you can see there's a lot of ramifications to this connection with self, right?
Oh, absolutely. I love the list. Thank you for running through those. I had a question. I was kind of expecting to hear self-compassion in that list. Would that be considered something that, if you have a good relationship with yourself, that you're able to have self-compassion, or?
Absolutely would. In fact, that's part of the issue, is the lack of compassion, is that resistance. I don't want to look, I don't want to feel, I don't want to deal. Right. In fact, that's part of what we're taught. Don't be selfish. I often talk with parents about that phrase, don't be selfish. That just means stop thinking about yourself, stop tuning into yourself. When do we say that to kids? Around 2 to 5 to 6 years old, which is the exact time period they're supposed to be getting connected with themselves. It's part of the training to be disconnected that is interwoven across the board in our culture of humanoids. So I think you're right about compassion. Don't be compassionate towards yourself. It's just simply focus on everybody else, which says, don't have enough compassion for yourself. That's the way I would think of it. So I would agree with you 100%. People that are well attuned to themselves are going to have compassion for themselves. You bet.
Yeah. Okay. So, you mentioned when you were showing the little list that you had there, that's part of recovery. So what does recovery look like from this disconnection from ourselves? And the reason I asked you what it might look like is I think a lot of people just are not aware. You've been maybe told that you are codependent and all these things, but nobody's telling you and you could do this, and here's how to start looking at that. So you said that you are in recovery from this condition of not being connected with yourself. What does that look like for you?
So there's a couple of very specific tools that I like to use that help me with that connection. One of them comes from Dan Siegel, actually from Brainstorm. This is on page 47, and it's called Mindsight Practice A. It's called SIFT, S-I-F-T. It's an acronym, and it stands for, it's actually 4 of these 15 dynamics: sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts. And when you have an experience that doesn't go well, or you're in distress of some kind, and you pause, you can learn to do SIFT in about 2 to 5 minutes. And it's a moment of pausing and connecting internally. What sensations am I feeling in my body? What images did that conjure up for me? What feelings, emotions am I having right now? And what thoughts are in the mix of that whole equation? And so it's only tapping into 4, but these are probably some of the most important 4 because of the role they play in our lives, okay? So that's one practice that I like a lot. Another one is a writing exercise that I learned about years ago. Probably the common name for it is stream of consciousness writing. Okay. Many people have heard of that. I was trained in what it was called hot penning. It's called hot penning because you keep the pen hot on the page. And it's a timed writing exercise. And literally, for me, the way I did it, I was taught by a therapist that said you do 45-minute hot pens. And I'm like, my ADHD brain could never do 45 minutes, okay? So I shortened it to 10 minutes, and I could do that, okay? So you set a timer, you turn the timer so you can't see it, and you have your first sentence, like, I'm doing a hot pen about really feeling angry right now. Okay. And You just put the pen on paper and you do not stop writing for any reason until the timer rings. And you don't watch the clock because the brain needs to go into an altered state. It's a semi-hypnotic state of the anger and all the energy around it, right? And over time, I realized that I was missing out on some stuff because I was shortened it down. And so I extended it and created what I call a series of hot pins, which is 3 hot pins with a walk in the middle of it. And the walk is actually bilateral stimulation, similar to what you might find in EMDR or other trauma therapy techniques. And so without getting into all the details, those are my 2 favorites in terms of when I really need to process something. And I've had some really profound experiences with just those 2. Anything that gets you into the body and into the emotions. Yeah. And this now takes us to good self-care. Many people talk about spa days, vacations, those kinds of things are wonderful, but they really are not self-care unless you have a foundation of emotional and body sensation work woven into it. If you're just taking a break, that's fine. There's value there, but that's not really self-care in the sense of helping my body and my systems rejuvenate. So
I just had a total light bulb moment when you said that about self-care, because we are at Hopestream, we are constantly preaching self-care, because your kid's struggling and, all that.
Yes.
But what I just realized is if you don't have really a relationship with yourself, self-care would seem like a very foreign concept. And also it would just feel very sort of mechanical, like, okay, I know I'm supposed to go on a walk, or I know I'm supposed to go.
It's a behavior.
Yes. And it wouldn't really deliver the desired results if you aren't saying, wait, I have a self to care for first.
Right. Exactly.
That's
yeah.
Okay. Because we have such a hard time convincing people like, yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, okay, yeah, I'll go on a walk. But now I'm understanding why that might be true for some people that just can't connect the dots there.
Right. Again, you can't change behavior by changing behavior. No. You got to know what's underneath it. And this takes me to the very first thing that I really learned in my parenting struggle to understand how to be a good dad. And that was what I call relationship first. And relationship first says that when I have a relationship with myself, I can form a relationship with my child that is different than just a behavior focus. And when I have a relationship with my child, then I can influence them in ways that I can never get to when I'm trying to control their behavior.
That is beautiful.
Yeah,
the control thing just does
it's huge.
Work.
Yeah, it just doesn't. So external dependency, I don't know if we have time to get to the affect regulation or the self-management, emotional management piece.
Let's do it.
But if we don't have that connection with self, you really can't really manage and self-regulate, re-regulate. But here's the bigger issue. Affect regulation is, again, one of those incredibly intense neural development-based activities. And if you think about where external dependency comes from, which is it's activated, I call it the catalyst factor, trauma. Trauma activates the disruption in the developmental process. I get to adulthood, I don't have the neurodevelopment I need. And so my capacity to truly self-regulate is going to be limited at best. And so part of recovery is, how do I re-engage neurodevelopment so that my nervous system can mature to a level that I can self-regulate, okay? So those are all pieces that are woven into this discussion. And recovery, I call it 3 different levels. Behavioral level, we don't ignore behavior, but it's not the key, right? It's where we start because it's what we can see, right? One of the things that I found myself doing as a dad was criticizing. Well, criticizing is incredibly damaging, especially to gentle-hearted children, right? And so when I think about my criticizing and how incredibly damaging that was, right? So now we look at this business of how do I regulate instead of criticize, right? How do I actually show up relationally instead of behaviorally? Anyway, I was going to go someplace else, but I can't remember where I was going. But anyway, sorry.
So what would that potentially look like? So instead of, criticizing my child, oh, you're always forgetting your backpack. Dude, every day you forget your backpack or whatever. What would a more regulated response look like?
Well, the regulated response is going to start with the relationship that says, sweetie, I can see that you're struggling with this. Do you know what that's about? And of course, they're going to say, I don't know. I'm trying to, right? It's like, honey, it's okay. Take a nice deep breath. When I say that, by the way, I'm teaching them to self-regulate, right? And so take a nice deep breath. Let's just kind of pause a moment. And if we can figure it out, that's great. If not, we'll just ponder it for a while. One of my favorite therapy tools is the tool of wondering. I write it on a piece of paper. I carry it with me for 2 weeks, wondering. I read it over and over. I wonder, where did this come from? What is this about? What do I need to do different? Anyway, side note. The bottom line is, how do I help my child take a deep breath, confirm inside, it's okay, it's not the end of the world, we'll figure this out. So when I'm thinking relationship first, I'm not focused on the frustration of the behavior in the same way. Does that mean it's not going to be frustrating? Of course not. Exasperation is probably the parent's most common factor, because it's really exasperating, right?
Yes.
Not because of bad kids, but because we don't know how to regulate and put it in the context of a relationship. So I think what it looks like is helping my child tune into the relationship with themselves and thinking about what's distracting me, what's interfering, what's causing me to lose focus, right?
Yeah.
And I can't help but think about Gabor Mate, who talks about, where does ADHD stuff come from, right?
I was just going to ask you about that. If this is really, I was fortunate enough to have him on the podcast when he launched The Myth of Normal, which please everybody read the book.
Amazing.
And and he was talking about the true roots of ADHD. And as you've been talking about this, I'm like, that's just been pulsating in my brain.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
And the world is not as friendly to our children either. It's not just that it's demanding more of us. And so we're having more difficulty in doing our work that is so important to us. The world is demanding and threatening in ways that are just unprecedented. And I think that that's part of the equation of the unprecedented numbers of ADHD and other issues.
Yeah, for sure. And we always talk about we as parents have to do our own work, right? And sometimes I think that can feel almost like a punishment. And I think what you've given, at least what I've absorbed from what you've said, is that us doing our work is truly a gift to ourselves first, is going to be a bonus, like overflow impact onto our kids, obviously our spouses or partners or whoever's around us. But that doing our own work is not like this, oh my God, like another thing to do. It's really being kind and generous to yourself to say, why am I responding in the ways that I am? And to be able to dig into that is really a generous thing to everybody around you.
Absolutely.
Right? Like it feels really, really kind.
Human beings are designed to do what Dan Siegel calls mind sight. Are you familiar with that term at all?
I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it.
So he defines it as the ability to look within one's own mind. Mind sight, to have sight within oneself. Introspection work is not just, like you said, a punishment or, I got to go to therapy. It's not even intended to be a therapy experience. It's intended to be a self-healing. It's intended to be making sense of things. It's intended to be processing emotions, giving my body and my mind the ability to let go, to accept, to relax. And we are designed with the capacity to do this work, but we lose touch with that when we lose touch with ourselves.
Yeah.
It's part of our nature of being humans to do that work.
Yeah.
Ongoing.
No, I love that. And we'll link to the Brainstorm book. I know that that's a very, very popular one.
Yeah, that's a good
if
one.
If you have any others that you want to send us, I'll put those in the show notes so that people can tap into those. It's so helpful to have a good recommendation instead of like you go to Amazon and look at the million parenting folks and it's like, oh boy.
Yeah.
I just want to rewind for 1 second on the exasperation and how we can have more measured responses if our kids are sort of losing it. And I know that a lot of the parents in our community have kids, and I had one of these who they are 0 to 100, right? Like you say one thing, hey, could you put the milk in the refrigerator? And they just lose it.
Yeah.
And is that part of this, or is that just a dynamic of that kid? I see it so often that I feel like I need to grab a second with you to ask that question.
Yeah. Well, as I'm sure you know and could guess along with all of us, there's many different reasons depending on temperament, depending on what other kinds of significant traumas, big traumas, not just little traumas, right? Might have happened along the way. What meaning did they assign to those events or those experiences? Bullying experiences, which are so profound. Anxieties and fears. I won't get distracted. Sorry, I'm starting to get distracted. But anyway, the bottom line is that when we look at the relationship between a parent and a child, I believe that the number one job of a parent is that co-regulator. And that means being grounded, being stable, being calm is what our children need the most from us. And that is super hard to do when we have external dependency stuff going on ourselves. Yeah. And so I think that's the biggest factor in the equation. I actually have a lesson that I do with parents in my other job that is the 24 strategies. And the 24 strategies are a different way to think about and engage with our children. And they include several paradigm shifts, like what are we going to replace consequences with? Because we don't want to ignore misbehavior. That's not, we're not promoting permissive parenting. Yeah. But what do we do different, right? That's a big question. It's an important one. But things like ongoing conversation, that's one of them. An ongoing conversation acknowledges that there is no such thing as, we just talked about that last night, for crying out loud. What does that mean to a child? See, this is part of the answer, I think, to your question. What does that mean to a child? It means you're stupid. You didn't get it. We already talked about it one time. You should have gotten it. We all know, especially experts in education, nobody learns from one time. It's repetition, 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 right? That's how we learn. So ongoing conversation, when a parent can embrace that one idea, then we can let go of the frustration when we're having the second time or the third time, okay? Because this is part of the process. This is how people learn. And so I think that when children feel the anxiety of a parent, when they feel the frustration of a parent, when they feel the shame that a parent might be struggling with, when they feel the exasperation of a parent, all of those things are personalized by the child because they are by definition immature. We're supposed to be by definition mature, but unfortunately, it doesn't quite, and it's not an insult, it's just an acknowledgement of, okay, yeah, I got disrupted, right? So when they experience any of those emotional things, then they're going to get defensive. And when they get defensive, then that puts up the wall. It could be volume, could be words. It could be, I'm not listening, I roll my eyes. It could be a lot of different ways that it shows up. And then exasperation becomes desperation and frustration to the hilt. And Yeah. I mean, there's so many places we could go with all of that, but
Well,
that's
that's good. The co-regulation part is a really good reminder because we are all so busy and so distracted and moving in so many different directions. And I think there's also a heightened level of just parental anxiety overall when we're seeing
yeah.
in the palm of our hand as we lay in bed at 6 o'clock in the morning, the first thing we see is the war that's going on in this country and the abuse that's going on here and the horrific things. It can make you feel
Yes.
like that is the only thing going on in the world. And so
Yes.
our level of anxiety, like we're walking into the day with our shoulders up here and we're like, if you're not watching on YouTube, you're not seeing my great antics. If you're just listening, you're missing that. But I think there is just this level of anxiety with parents that is rubbing off and is like you
Yes.
can't walk into a room and not feel it. Everybody is just at
Absolutely.
a whole new level. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And children are saying, do I have a future?
Yes.
What is going to be there for me?
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely. Especially our teens who are looking at AI and they're looking at the state of the world. Like,
Yep.
I don't think I'd want to be going, okay, I am only like 15 years into this thing. This is what I've got. That could
Right.
be really scary for a very sensitive.
Right.
And, the parents, I would say 98.9% of the parents in our community describe their kids as highly sensitive. Both
Yes.
emotionally, tactically, somatically, everything. Like we just have these kids who their nerve endings are exposed to the world. And so you get that sensitivity, combined
Yes.
with what's going on. And it is just super hard for them to cope.
Yep. And those are connected to trauma and disrupted development too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
absolutely.
we could go on for days and days,
Yeah,
but
we
I think
could.
we may have to do a part 2. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
I would look forward to it.
Yes, this has
Yeah.
been incredibly enlightening. My light bulb moment on self-care is going to be very helpful, I think, because I'm going to approach
Good.
that in a different way. And I just thank you so much for your time.
You bet. It's my privilege. Thank you for having me here. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week and a weekend. We get a weekend
Yes,
coming
and
up.
a weekend
That's good,
too.
right?
Awesome.
All right.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
All righty.